What's going on, guys? My name's Chris Randone, and I'm here joined today by the one and only number one fantasy sports player in the world, Alex. What's going on, my man?
Not much, man. Looking forward to talking some ownership with you. How's it going with you?
Going good, man. Yeah, ownership. So today, Alex and I decided to kind of go through the ins and outs of ownership and help people understand kind of what role ownership plays in as far as your analysis and research, and really just dive in and give an insight to help people understand the overall information that ownership can provide to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of crazy because like a few years ago, like ownership projections didn't exist. So it's like you kind of had to eyeball it. But now with Osmo and other sites have their own ownership projections, it's like you can go online and get a pretty good idea of who everyone's going to play every day. So what's your take on like how do you use ownership as part of your strategy?
I would say ownership, first off, helps me kind of understand my opponents. So it's kind of having like that study film before players go into a game, they watch film of the other team. And basically you're just having a good understanding of where other players are at, who they're picking, why they're picking them. And it plays a big role because it helps you understand where you want to go in direction of your lineups. That's differentiating yourself between the chalk or being contrarian. And that's something that we're going to really hone in on today on today's call.
Absolutely. I think one of the really cool things that FantasyCruncher just added is you can see the Osmo ownership on there if you have FantasyCruncher Pro. And that allows you to streamline your process because you can see the ownership when you're making lineups. You can sort by ownership, and we'll show you how to do all those things today.
Yeah, I think there's several factors behind ownership. And a lot of those things that play a role are like the data from Vegas, the over-unders, implied run totals, really understanding the ballpark and pitching matchups. These all play a role in seeing where ownership lies. And this is very vital information for anyone out there who is not really using ownership or understand or really doesn't know what ownership is. FantasyCruncher gives you a real clear direction of seeing everything right in front of you. So having that ownership there really gives you kind of clarity on where everyone is choosing their lineups tonight and also where you can go in the direction of your lineup.
Absolutely. So let's make some lineups here and we can talk about how you use it in FantasyCruncher. So tonight I think we have a 9-game slate. So first of all, in baseball, we already went over stacking. What kind of stack are you going with tonight?
Tonight, are we talking FanDuel or?
FanDuel, yeah.
All right, yeah, probably. I mean, 4-4. As far as teams right now, I haven't really dived in too much. Besides, I am heavy on Houston. So
Awesome.
if you want to play with Houston right now, we can go ahead and do that.
Let's just do I said the randomness pretty high, so we should get a good mix of some different teams here. So I'll just go ahead and start a crunch.
Okay.
So what about Houston is really appealing to you?
So Houston tonight, they are very cheap across the board outside of Bregman and Brantley, and they're at home against Kyle Hendricks, who is not the greatest pitcher. He does have some great stats this year, but he has struggled on the road as well. So Houston allows me to kind of free up some salary relief when constructing my lineups because I am high on Blake Snell tonight and Baumgartner, who are fairly highly priced at the pitching position. So having a nice run implied total like Houston does have in the upper fives and the given matchup that they have, that's kind of a direction I want to look in deeper tonight.
Absolutely. So I think you hit a lot of good points. What I'm seeing in this crunch is that I'm only coming up with 3% Houston, which is showing me that it's more of a contrarian play because what FantasyCruncher does, I plugged in my projections, it's optimizing for the highest point projections. But this is telling me Houston doesn't necessarily have it doesn't give you the highest point projection, but if everyone else is optimizing to create their lineups and you see an edge there, you're getting an edge over the field because you're not competing with as many people to get that number one spot that pays out the big money.
Yeah, and one thing I like about this is not seeing Houston there is it also gives me the flexibility to know that one of my analysis that I've done allow me to have kind of a team that's not being looked at, but then I'm allowed to go ahead and use maybe that Atlanta team or that Baltimore team or that Detroit team. And if I'm multi-entering in these lineups, I can use bits and pieces from each of these top tiered stacks that are probably going to be more owned compared to Houston, but it'll still allow me that flexibility to have exposure to all these teams and still have something that doesn't necessarily have a lot of high ownership on.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you've identified Houston as a contrarian stack, you can pair them with anybody. You could go contrarian, but more likely than not, you're going to want to go with a higher value team, one that's a little bit more popular, because you're trying to hit that sweet spot between having a high projection and having low ownership.
Right. And the thing is, too, is, and we'll go and discuss it on here shortly, but you don't want to have too much chalk, regardless. I mean, depending upon other variables like the slate size and things of that nature. But understanding, though, if you have chalk, it's more or less than likely that you're going to be able to take down a big tournament because you're probably going to have the same team as a lot of others. Yeah,
it's always a bummer when you nail the best player of the night, say it's Derek Dietrich with 3 home runs, but 1 in 6 lineups have him, so that's like 20,000 lineups in some tournaments. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to sort by projection. I'm going to create a couple benchmarks here. One is the highest projection that I'm getting, so that's 134 on tonight's slate. And the second is the highest ownership, which is 160. And what we're going to do, we're going to use those as comparison points for when we evaluate a lineup. And with FantasyCruncher, you can find your stacks using this. If you click over to Team Stacks, I just selected all the Houston stacks, and we can kind of see what our lineups are going to be looking like.
Yeah, and I mean, here is seeing the top projected point total being around 133 or 137, whatever the case may be. It's also important when you see something like this is where you don't want to get too far outside of that range to where you're 25% low or 25 points lower than what the highest projected total was in your crunch. Because then it's going to be fairly hard to make up for those projected points if you're now rostering a lineup that doesn't even have the potential to come even close to what you just crunched throughout the rest of your lineups.
Yeah, I think when you take a expensive stack, especially, like, you're kind of paying up to be contrarian, so the projection isn't as high, but you still want to have a good shot at cashing, which is what the projected points is a really good indication of. And so we're finding out our top stack with Houston in our crunch is about 123 projected points, so 10 points below the maximum that we came up with. And to me, that's an acceptable range. I usually want to stay within 10-15 points of the over maximum possible projection. I usually find that that's like the sweet spot where you can start to have a team that's really unique, but also have a great shot of having a high finish.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that 10-15 point threshold is the max as far as staying within the range of your highest projected team, and then going through and really selecting teams that do have that same potential, but yet play a little bit more contrarian role when it comes to your overall lineup.
So what I'm going to do, we kind of got a sense of how our Houston stacks are looking. I'm going to just generate more Houston stacks so that we can sort them all with these various metrics, and then we can go ahead and pick whichever one we think has the best chance of winning tonight.
Okay.
So I just made 179 Houston stacks. Our top projection is 127. That's within 6 points. The ownership is 93. That's 70% lower than the highest one we had in our last crunch. So what do you think about this lineup?
This lineup I am okay with. It's 4 points higher, which is almost 50%. And I do see a lot of potential given the fact that the Braves were the highest owned team when it came to the crunch as far as across the board and how many they've showed up as far as exposure. But the only thing that maybe I would be reluctant on is the pitchers. So what I would do here is I would probably roster this one, but I would also want to switch up the pitcher and see if there was a way where I could still increase my point total, maybe take away someone like Freddie Freeman and get a little lower high value first baseman and try to move up and get like the Snell, who's the highest projected player on the slate, and see if that kind of helps in my favor, or does it decline in my favor.
Awesome. I think what we're seeing with this crunch is that these Houston players are so low priced that it's just forcing in the highest price guys, and that's why we're ending up with something like this, where maybe if you're stacking Houston, you want to get Bregman and you want to get some of the other higher price guys at the top of the order. So this is kind of like you're not getting the batters you really want, and the rest of the lineup is pretty chalky, and that's a recipe for having a high projection, but not necessarily the best construction.
Right. And you can see here, I mean, even in this one right here, if the one that you just scrolled past, the Baltimore one, I think the ownership, I don't know where it went, but the ownership was
here we go.
Right there. So, I mean, 20%, 28, 26%, 22%. I mean, about half your lineup is chalk. And so, I mean, you're kind of relying on that contrarian play right there, too, to hit off. And if it does hit off, I mean, you're looking in great shape, because if the chalk goes off and then your contrarian goes off, I mean, that's a recipe for success.
Yeah, you have a clear path to winning with this lineup. And what I'd say has to happen is Michael Brantley at 1% owned, one of the strongest players for the Astros. If he has a huge day, that's going to rocket you to the top. But
yes,
the 123 total ownership is pretty close to that threshold we set of 160. So let's scroll down a little bit more. We can find some more contrarian options that that might be even better suited for the GPP strategy we want.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing a lot of Houston, a lot of Baltimore, a lot of Atlanta, Baltimore. This one is Kansas City. A little bit less ownership, it looks like. What do you think about this?
I actually kind of like this team because if you look at this team compared to, let's say, the Orioles, I look at one variable that kind of provides a lot of upside, and that's stolen bases with Mondesi and Lopez. So I'm now rostering a team that has an implied run total. They're playing at a favorable park in Chicago. And on top of that, they provide some extra upside with stolen bases and scoring runs. Because I mean, if they steal a base, they put themselves in a scoring position. Then they get a base hit. And what I like about that is that Soler and O'Hearn, they're below them. So if they're getting on base and they're stealing, it puts Soler and O'Hearn in a position to have an RBI opportunity.
Right on. Yeah, I think this is a pretty solid lineup with some contrarian, some chalk, and I think that's a good idea. Let's let's go down to the bottom, and we can kind of see what actually I'll sort by ownership.
Okay.
And I will go to the lowest zone, and we can kind of see what that projection is a little bit too low. I'll try to find one that's low owned, but also has like a decent projection. All right.
Yeah, and just to point out for those of you that are watching, and just understanding, like when it comes to value plays and understanding the projected ownership, if there's a player that is a top value play, maybe someone that's coming off the bench, they're low priced, yet they're not necessarily projected to score a high total. That's something where sometimes you want to fade unless they have the opportunity of really projecting to score a certain total. And that comes between that 20 and 60% threshold. So basically when it comes down to it is if there's a player, let's just say, I don't know if there's one like Jack Mayfield. So we have Jack Mayfield here who is fairly new to the lineup. He's in there due to injuries. He's someone who's almost the lowest priced possible with 2,200. Here, I mean, this is an extreme value play. So understanding the construction of the lineup and realizing that how value plays can help you not necessarily win a lineup, but those are the difference makers there that provide a lot of upside, that value play that no one's really on, that you see that could provide a lot of upside.
Yeah, I think more than anything, it just makes this roster work because what we're seeing is we got this team at Coors that's super high priced. It's almost impossible to like fit in a lineup. And then what I also see is like we have 1, 2, 3 projected for the Astros. We have that value play at 7, where if they do well, he'll get some more at bats, and that's going to make him have a great shot of exceeding his projection. And we have a punt play at pitcher, which isn't ideal, but that's kind of what you have to do if you wanna fit in those high price bats.
Yeah, and sometimes there's always a lot of fear with rostering someone in the 7, 8, or 9 hole because people are just biased to wanting to roster the bigger names or the people at the top of the lineup. But I mean, here's an example. Last night, Chicago Cubs, bottom of their lineup went off. Bote had 2 home runs. Russell had a home run. Hayward had a home run. And I mean, they were all low priced. And this is a common example of rostering a team that not really a lot of people are on, that fit into a lineup that hold a lot of upside and power. And if they go off, I mean, it puts you in a great position.
Yeah, I think we see it here because, I mean, Carson Kelly is not a great example of buying 8th, but he's 0.1% owned. If you have that guy that's like 1% owned, they get a couple of home runs. And the team does well, which gives them more at-bats. That's a great recipe to take down GPP. So I think what I would do with this, if I was just looking to make Houston lineups, what I would do is I'd sort by projection, go to the very bottom, delete out the lowest projected teams. Since we made 180, you could probably delete the bottom 40 or 50. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to spend all that time clicking right now. But then we sort by ownership. We delete the highest owned ones, which 125, that's pretty close to the highest owned lineups we came across in any of our crunches. So just delete the top ones. And what we're going to end up with is something in the middle. So this one, like for example, has a 123 projection, 70 ownership, and that's kind of like that sweet spot of balancing the two.
Yeah. I mean, this is a lineup where you have a little bit of chalk, you have a nice chunk of contrarian, and I mean, you have a pitcher who, I mean, holds a lot of potential to score a lot of points. And 22% for an ace like Blake Snell, in this given matchup is not necessarily the highest. I mean, 35, 40%, that's where it gets high. But I mean, that's still a sweet spot for someone like Blake Snell in this position at home against Toronto.
Yeah, I think what you're going to find with him is when you have a guy that's 12K almost, like you have to get those value bats. And what we're seeing in the stack is that you have the 5, 6, 8, and 9 hitters for Houston. Not ideal. So one thing you could do to make this lineup even better is if you want Snell in Houston, maybe you go with a 4-3, and that just gives you a little bit more flexibility with the roster. Get a little bit higher projection. You don't have as much correlation. But you can always like work with each of those 3 factors, projection, correlation, and ownership, to kind of find a roster that really meets what you think is going to be the best of the night.
Yeah, and I think it's also cool that even when you're in this lineup right here, FantasyCruncher gives you the ability to swap people out. So, I mean, let's just say you wanted to swap out Snell and go down to the next highest projected pitcher, which would probably be Buehler, I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, you could even go to Bumgarner if they're a little bit same in price. So here we go right here. Change just a little bit, but now you have some salary relief to go somewhere else and maybe get that big bat. So maybe, Marcinick, if you wanted to upgrade him and go for a bigger bat, or, I mean, even Tyler White. Probably would do Tyler White, honestly, because he's horrible. But I mean, this just shows you kind of the power of utilizing Cruncher within itself. When you've already just ran a crunch, you can go there and edit right on the spot, and play with it to give yourself a higher projected total, which I think is really cool and unique. Because then if that's a lineup you like, save it, and you can go ahead and import it into your play.
Yeah, I think. You can tweak with it. That's really good if you have the time. And what's so great about FantasyCruncher is you can generate 500 lineups at once, and then just delete some of the ones you don't like. Have a system set up for doing it, and then you'll have enough to browse through where you can find Houston with Bumgarner, Houston with Snell, and see how all those look, and choose the ones you really like.
Yeah, really cut down your time and just focus on the lineups that matter to you.
So I think we showed how you can integrate ownership into your process. Make sure you use the code The Crunch when you sign up for Osmo. You can get FantasyCruncher as part of the package. You get half off your first monthly or weekly package using that code. Chris, any final words?
No, it was a pleasure going over ownership with you. And for those out there, if you don't have FantasyCruncher yet or you're not using Osmo's tools and resources, the code The Crunch. And we'll talk to you guys next time.